Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and today we are talking about Facebook because I'm talking about how Facebook is going to kill society. Now, as you know, we are living in politically divided times. I like to say cybersecurity is agnostic to politics, even though we're not immune from it, but there's no real denying that we have some very serious breakdowns of trust between two political sides. We also see the loudest voices in the room being more and more extreme on each side, and here I am stuck in the middle with you. But Facebook has quite frankly dropped a supercharger in this over the years, and now they're not doing much for the 2022 election, not to mention other elections around the globe, despite them saying that they would. Now, I think this is an important topic, and I think anybody that lives in a country that considers itself a democracy or even an anocracy really needs to consider these points. Now, this was basically prompted by a recent article in Vice News, pulling sources from the New York Times and other places, and I'm in the process of basically writing an article with a much bigger footprint than this one on this exact thing, as well as working on a video, regarding this sooner than later. But here's a primer for this discussion to get this ball rolling, to just basically put you in this mindset. This comes from David Gilbert of Vice News, who basically I'm paraphrasing or quoting quite heavily here because honestly, it's a fantastic article that he wrote, and I'm just looking at this just kind of in a much larger scope than he is. Now, here's what's going on, and again, much of these are his words, but it really starts this conversation here. In 2018, Mark Zuckerberg, CEO and founder of Facebook, now called Meta, basically claimed that he cared about making sure that Facebook wasn't being used to undermine democracy. Quote, "The most important thing I care about right now is making sure no one interferes in the various 2018 elections around the world." Now, Zuckerberg also said that during basically this marathon 5-hour testimony that he put in front of Congress in April of that year, where he was grilled basically about how the Kremlin was weaponizing Facebook during the 2016 election to spread disinformation and chaos. If you recall, this also came off the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where essentially they were data mining tens of millions of users, building psychological profiles so that they could sell that to political campaigns. Ted Cruz was a recipient of that, senator from Texas, and as was the Donald Trump campaign. Steve Bannon, obviously a Trump associate, was also investing in that corporation as well, and basically he was the one that brought them to the table. Now, fast forward to today in 2022, and Zuckerberg is apparently more concerned with money and the metaverse now. Obviously, this huge push, this big focus, changing the name of the company, which I still think they did to deflect blame. That said, they've got a very heavy push into Meta, or the metaverse, creating their own, and here we are. Now, as the crucial midterm elections are coming up here in the United States, two reports basically that have just recently came out gave credence to the claim that Zuckerberg now cares less about securing elections and more about the metaverse and all those different kinds of things. Basically, this really sucks. Now, the New York Times reported very recently, like a week or so ago, that Zuckerberg no longer meets regularly with his election team anymore, and his top priority is instead the Metaverse project. Basically, this report also revealed that a number of employees dedicated to monitoring election threats and election integrity were essentially gutted, meaning there were 300 of them full-time in 2020. Now there's just 60. Population hasn't shrunk. Elections haven't gotten smaller. That obviously is a huge, huge concern. Not to mention the fact that 300 full-time people, basically looking at election stuff is nothing compared to what it really should be, given that Facebook has billions of users out there, but I digress. Now, as an example of how this new outlook basically could allow election conspiracies to spread unchecked on Facebook and other platforms that they own, the New York Times pointed out basically the new conspiracy theory movie known as 2000 Mules, which I have seen, and my God, if you know anything about technology, GPS, and actual law, it's pretty far-fetched, to be perfectly honest. I am not going to adjudicate that, so if you comment to me on 2000 Mules, your opinions are your own. Coming from a technological standpoint, I punch a lot of holes in that thing. Now, that said, as I mentioned, the New York Times reported that Dinesh D'Souza's 2000 Mules conspiracy theory video racked up over 430,000 engagements on Facebook in this month alone. That would be June. So, tracking how disinformation spreads on Facebook, obviously is a difficult thing, but they have a tool called CrowdTangle. This is Facebook's tool. They purchased this in 2018 and has become, quite frankly, a critical way for researchers and journalists to track disinformation trends around elections, not just here, but in any country that has elections where Facebook is incredibly popular. Now, Facebook has historically been averse to sharing information with its researchers, and it looks like they're phasing out this tool as well. So that's awesome. The shutdown of CrowdTangle began last year with most of its former employees leaving or being reassigned to roles in other parts of Meta. In January of 2022, Meta paused the ability of new users to register for CrowdTangle. That's a hold that is still in place, meaning if you wanted to go and sign up for CrowdTangle, you're out of luck. Now, no new features have been added in the last 16 months, and researchers have reported that the tool is no longer working as expected. The reason for this, according to Bloomberg, and a report basically this past week or so as well, is that fewer than 5 engineers on Facebook's London integrity team were now working on CrowdTangle to keep it operational, meaning they have been gutting that staff as well. This means that there's now very little support that basically for the multitude of organizations that use CrowdTangle. This is a tool that's been used by journalists, researchers, academics, and human rights organizations in places like Myanmar and Sri Lanka, where Facebook has basically been accused of facilitating genocides. And that is absolutely true. I've written on that. I've done a radio show on that. That is a huge thing. The disinformation campaign in Myanmar alone just displaced millions of people, slaughtered Rohingya Muslims. It was a complete and utter travesty. And Facebook as essentially was the platform of choice for the disinformation warfare campaign from that authoritarian government. And interestingly enough, Myanmar claimed to be a democracy, and here we are. Now, researchers basically fear that things are going to get worse come November in the 2022 midterms election. Now, a spokesperson for Meta talking to Bloomberg said that CrowdTangle would work for the 2022 midterms, just as it did for the 2022 presidential election, adding that the company has plans to, quote, make a even more valuable, end quote, tool or tools for researchers, although the spokesperson did not say when those tools would be available. But, as one expert pointed out, the replacement system proposed by Facebook so far is not really up to code compared to CrowdTangle. Dr. Rebecca Tromble, director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, on a tweet about a week ago or so said, and I quote, "The system proposed to replace CrowdTangle is so far terrible, but most importantly, it's inaccessible to journalists who are the bulwark for public accountability and democracy. If I can access CrowdTangle and journalists can't, we all lose." That, I think, is an incredibly true statement. Journalism keeps political governments accountable. And I think that's so unbelievably important, which is why when you see leaders undermining things like the free press, it's never a healthy sign in any kind of democracy or anocracy. Now, the US midterms, obviously, as I mentioned, are just one election taking place this year. All around the planet, there are a ton of other elections. We've obviously just recently seen one in France, not to mention others as well, that basically these elections, though, especially in many places around the world, remain vulnerable to disinformation shared on Facebook. And so aside from elections, there are numerous other events in which CrowdTangle could be used to track how dangerous narratives are being shared online. Now, according to Marc-Andre Argentino, he's an extremism researcher and PhD candidate at Concordia, and his tweet about a week ago as well said, and I quote, "This tool was crucial to the analysis of COVID-19 disinformation, threats from the Boogaloo Boys following the death of George Floyd, hybrid threats, etc. So many colleagues, journalists, and researchers benefit greatly from CrowdTangle," end quote. Now, Facebook has, as I mentioned, almost 3 billion monthly users, and for hundreds of millions of Americans, Facebook is and still the primary way they communicate and their main source of news or information, meaning your friend posts something, you trust your friend, you take that information and you spread it. Could be incorrect, your friend could be wrong. Nevertheless, this is how misinformation basically stems from disinformation, and here we are. Now, with the midterms approaching, Facebook and Zuckerberg's focus on making money in the metaverse, obviously is a very worrying development, as David Gilbert put it, and he's absolutely correct. And I quote, no, actually, I don't quote anymore. That is essentially what he was talking about. But I want to talk about this because the above information that I just laid out here, plus a whole bunch of other revealing news that we got from Facebook recently, meaning they have been data mining hospitals, and in fact, 33 of the top 100 hospital systems here in the United States were integrating basically the Meta tracking pixel that essentially was giving Facebook your health information as you were logging in to health portals to schedule appointments or talk to your doctor or whatever you were doing. Is obviously very terrifying. Facebook has a reach absolutely everywhere, but we have seen essentially what the Facebook algorithms can do to disinformation. Thanks to Frances Haugen, the whistleblower, they've essentially dropped a supercharger into disinformation and misinformation being spread like wildfire. It's some of the most angry rhetoric on the platform, and they are prioritizing it with their artificial intelligence because it makes them money. Facebook has been essentially eroding and really knocking down or helping to knock down the soft guardrails that make a democracy function. Those unwritten rules, things like mutual toleration, essentially, as Ziblatt put it in the book How Democracies Die, is one of those things that is such an unbelievable problem that we have right now that we really need to focus on these things. We really need to be able to essentially look at a Facebook and say, this is completely unacceptable. I believe that Mark Zuckerberg has a moral and ethical responsibility to be as honest and as accurate, with the findings of disinformation and transparent as well. Now, if you're thinking, oh, Nick, oh my God, you're into censorship, you don't believe in freedom of speech. No, the answer is not that. I'm not a fan of, basically yelling fire in a crowded theater. That's against the Constitution. We do not have a constitutional right to do that. And quite frankly, a lot of this misinformation and disinformation, especially for those that are uninformed, that see this from a quote-unquote trusted source, meaning a friend, a relative, somebody that they trust in their regular life, is in many ways tantamount to yelling fire in a crowded theater. And that is something that I think we have to understand, meaning we have to train the population on how to basically be educated, how to learn, how to vet, how to take things skeptically. When I'm given information by anybody, I don't open it. I research it, I look at it, I understand it, I look for sources to see where did this come from, can this be verified, are there things that back it up, and not everybody goes through that because everybody sees the headline article and then they respond. And I know this for a fact because a lot of the comments I get on everything that I post are simply this. It recently happened when I did a video on Elon Musk. Is he an entrepreneur, genius, thinker, or is he a scam artist? And I got a lot of responses like, well, why can't he both? He's this, he's that, he's this. And that wasn't the point of my video. I went through that, but people were basically not realizing that I had drawn a conclusion that was similar to theirs because they simply didn't watch or listen to what I said. So this is obviously a huge problem. We really need to focus on this. We're going to see where this goes in the future, but quite frankly, we've got a serious problem here with disinformation and misinformation. Facebook is reducing their staff, and as we have seen in past elections, the disinformation campaigns from foreign intelligence groups, from political operatives, from extremists that are trying to control basically a population that may lean their way to lean further their way is going to be rampant. It already is. We see it constantly. I even see it in my own Facebook feeds and whatnot, as well as other social media. Facebook's not the only offender, they're just the largest one. This is a huge problem. So that is your news of the day. By the time this video is uploading, since I'm traveling, it'll probably be 3 days from now, but eventually you will see or this video or listen to this podcast because this is a huge problem we need to combat, and we need to combat it yesterday. And quite frankly, it is time once again for me to say, it's time to put Mark Zuckerberg in jail. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP, where you will get misinformation apparently and be lied to. And as always, feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please attempt to stay private. Thanks, everyone.